And she would. This wasn't the end of the story. What would you do if the person serving your food secretly disrespected you? James Carter, a retired Marine, had faced enemies on the battlefield, but he never expected to face one in a quiet, upscale restaurant. He came in for a simple meal, but the moment his waiter smirked and placed the plate in front of him, James knew something wasn't right. James Carter, a retired black Marine in his late 60s, stepped into the upscale restaurant, looking for nothing more than a quiet meal. Dressed in a simple yet neat jacket with his military service pins, he carried himself with the dignity and discipline of a man who had served his country with honor. The restaurant was elegant, filled with well-dressed customers enjoying their meals under the glow of chandeliers. The soft hum of conversation and clinking silverware created an air of sophistication. James had dined in many places like this before, but today something felt off. As he walked toward an empty table near the window, he noticed a few glances in his direction. Some were polite, others less so. He had been in situations like this before, where people saw his skin before they saw the man. But he had long learned not to let such things bother him. A young white waiter, Kyle, stood near the entrance, chatting with a coworker. He made brief eye contact with James, but then looked away, continuing his conversation as if James wasn't there. James took a seat and waited. A few moments passed, then several more. He noticed Kyle moving swiftly between tables, taking orders, refilling drinks, and chatting politely with the well-dressed white customers around him. Still, no one approached James. He remained patient, observing. A young couple who arrived after him had already been served water and given menus. Another man had his order taken within minutes of sitting down. James cleared his throat slightly, making sure he was visible, but Kyle walked right past him without a word. Finally, after nearly 10 minutes, James decided to take the first step. He raised a hand slightly as Kyle passed by. "Excuse me, young man, could I get a menu, please?" Kyle barely looked at him. With a sigh, he grabbed a menu from a nearby stand and placed it on the table without making eye contact. He didn't say a word before walking away. James looked down at the menu and smiled slightly to himself. He had seen many things in his life, but blatant disrespect never ceased to amaze him. As he picked up the menu, he made a decision. He would not react with anger or frustration. Instead, he would wait, observe, and handle this the way a Marine handled every challenge, with patience, strategy, and precision. What Kyle didn't know was that this would be a day he would never forget. Kyle barely spared James a glance as he walked away, leaving the veteran sitting alone with the menu in his hands. James let out a quiet breath, his fingers lightly tapping the table. He had faced far worse in life than an inattentive waiter, but there was something about the young man's attitude that didn't sit right with him. Across the room, Kyle was all smiles, laughing with a group of diners as he poured their drinks with ease. His posture was relaxed, his tone friendly, completely different from the dismissive, almost hostile way he had treated James. James watched as another waiter, a young Latina woman, passed by and greeted a new table with a bright, genuine smile. Her energy was different, attentive, warm, professional. He wondered if the problem was just Kyle, or if this restaurant had a deeper issue with the way it treated certain customers. Kyle finally returned, his expression bored. "Know what you want?" he asked, not bothering with the usual politeness one would expect in a high-end restaurant. James set the menu down and gave a slow nod. "I'll have the steak, medium rare, mashed potatoes on the side." Kyle scribbled down the order, not even looking up. "Fine. You want water or something else?" James glanced at the half-empty glasses of wine on the tables around him, the neatly poured drinks resting on crisp white tablecloths. "Just water," he said evenly. Kyle didn't respond, just turned and walked off, disappearing into the kitchen. James sat back in his chair, observing the restaurant as he waited. His training had taught him patience, but the more he watched Kyle, the clearer the pattern became. A group of young professionals at the far end of the room waved Kyle over, and he practically jogged to their table, flashing them a charming smile. When a white-haired older gentleman signaled for the check, Kyle was there in seconds, polite and efficient. But when James turned slightly, making eye contact as Kyle passed by again, the young man ignored him completely. Minutes ticked by, then more. James had been in the restaurant long enough to see at least 3 other tables receive their food, tables that had ordered after him. His patience remained, but something about this moment felt heavier than just a single rude waiter. Then Kyle reappeared, holding a glass of water. Without a word, he placed it in front of James, with just a little too much force, the water sloshing over the rim onto the tablecloth. James looked up at him. Kyle didn't say a word. He just turned and walked away. James reached for his napkin, dabbing the spill as he exhaled slowly. This was no accident. This was deliberate. But James wasn't going to react just yet. He wanted to see just how far Kyle was willing to go. James kept his posture relaxed, but inside he was watching everything. Every movement, every interaction, every sign that this was more than just bad service. Across the room, Kyle leaned against the counter near the kitchen entrance, scrolling through his phone. He wasn't busy. He wasn't overwhelmed. He had simply chosen not to serve James with the same respect he gave to others. James glanced at the other waitstaff. Some were moving efficiently between tables, carrying trays, refilling drinks, and engaging politely with customers. Others, like the young Latina server, looked genuinely invested in their work. But Kyle? He barely seemed interested in his job, except when it came to certain customers. Then James noticed something else. Kyle had stepped into the kitchen, laughing with a coworker. His body language was casual, smug even. He gestured toward the dining area, and though James couldn't hear the words, he could tell by the way Kyle chuckled that the joke was about him. James had seen men like Kyle before, young, cocky, and convinced they were untouchable. A moment later, Kyle grabbed a plate from the counter. James immediately recognized the dish, his steak and mashed potatoes. But then, right before heading out, Kyle hesitated. A cruel grin spread across his face. James watched as Kyle leaned slightly over the plate. The moment was quick, almost unnoticeable. But James saw it. Kyle straightened, still smirking, and carried the plate out of the kitchen. James didn't react. Not yet. Kyle walked toward him, his steps slow and deliberate. He placed the plate down with exaggerated care, the same smug look still on his face. "There you go," he said flatly. "Enjoy." James stared at the food in front of him. He didn't move, didn't pick up his fork. Kyle stood there for a second, waiting for James to take the first bite, as if challenging him. When James didn't, Kyle's smirk deepened before he turned and strolled away. James exhaled slowly. His patience had been tested in ways Kyle could never imagine. He had faced enemies on the battlefield, had endured hardships this young man could never comprehend. And yet this moment filled him with a quiet, simmering disappointment. Not just for Kyle, for everyone who had ever been treated like this. He wasn't going to eat the food, but he wasn't going to walk away either, because this wasn't over. Not yet. James sat still, staring at the plate in front of him. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, but his expression remained unreadable. His grip tightened slightly around the fork, but he didn't lift it. Kyle had already walked away, too arrogant to even check if James would eat the food. That told James everything he needed to know. This wasn't just carelessness. It was deliberate. He took a slow breath, calming the fire that burned just beneath the surface. Reacting in anger wasn't his way. He had been taught better. He had lived through worse. Instead, he decided to do something Kyle wouldn't expect. Raising his hand, James signaled another passing waiter. The young Latina server, the one who had been polite and professional to everyone, noticed him immediately. She approached with a warm, attentive expression. "Sir, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice kind. James glanced at her name tag. "Isabella," he said, offering a polite nod. "Would you mind sending your manager over? I'd like to have a word." Isabella hesitated for only a second, her eyes flicking toward the untouched plate in front of him. Then she nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll get him right away." As she walked off, James sat back in his chair, his posture calm, but his mind sharp. He wasn't here to cause a scene. He was here to teach a lesson, one that Kyle and everyone watching would not forget. The minutes felt longer than they were, but James didn't rush. He could feel the shifting energy in the restaurant, subtle but present. A few nearby customers had started noticing the tension, stealing glances toward him. Then from across the room, he saw Kyle finally register what was happening. The smirk on his face faltered as he watched Isabella speaking with a middle-aged man in a suit, the manager. James didn't look away. He wanted Kyle to feel it. That slow, creeping realization that whatever power he thought he held in this situation was slipping away. The manager, Mr. Daniels, approached the table with a professional but slightly cautious expression. "Good evening, sir," he said. I understand you wanted to speak with me? James gave a small nod, his voice steady. Yes, I did. Before we begin, I want you to know something. Mr. Daniels frowned slightly but remained attentive. I'm not here to yell. I'm not here to make a scene. But I am here to hold someone accountable. James tapped the table gently, his gaze unwavering. I think we both know what I'm about to say. So why don't you go ahead and call Kyle over? Across the room, Kyle went pale. Because now he knew. He had messed with the wrong man. Kyle hesitated, his posture stiffening as he realized there was no way out of this. He had spent the evening treating James with open disrespect, never once considering that he might be held accountable. Now, under the bright lights of the restaurant, with his manager watching, Kyle could feel the weight of his actions settling on him like a stone. Mr. Daniels turned, his voice firm. Kyle, come here. Now. The entire restaurant seemed quieter, as if people sensed something important was about to happen. A few nearby customers paused mid-conversation, their eyes flicking toward the unfolding scene. Kyle swallowed hard but tried to keep his cocky demeanor as he strolled over. Yeah, boss, he said, forcing a casual tone. Mr. Daniels folded his arms. This gentleman has something to say, and you're going to listen. James didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of decades of experience, of discipline, of knowing exactly how to command a room without ever shouting. You looked at me the moment I walked in here, James said, his gaze locked onto Kyle's. And you made a choice. You decided I wasn't worth your time. You ignored me, you disrespected me, and then, when you finally brought me my food, you made sure it came with something extra. Kyle's face twisted in fake confusion. I don't know what you're talking about. James tilted his head slightly. Don't lie, son. Not now. Not when you know there are cameras in that kitchen. At that, Kyle flinched. Mr. Daniels' eyes darkened. He turned sharply toward the host stand. Marcus, go to the back and pull the security footage from the kitchen. I want it on my desk in 5 minutes. Kyle's breath hitched. His confidence was unraveling. Come on, boss, it's not that serious. James reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Slowly, deliberately, he dialed a number. The call connected after one ring. Hey, Captain, James said, his voice steady. I'm going to need you to come down to Winston's Steakhouse. Got a situation here that involves food tampering. Yeah, I'll wait. He ended the call and placed his phone on the table. Kyle looked like he might faint. Wait, who did you just call? James finally smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Someone who takes matters like this very seriously. Mr. Daniels narrowed his eyes. Who was that, Mr. Carter? James leaned back. An old friend of mine, chief of police. Kyle's face turned ghost white, because now he knew. This wasn't just a bad shift at work. This was about to change his life forever. Kyle stood frozen, his face drained of all color. The arrogance, the smirks, the dismissive attitude. It was all gone now. He glanced toward the restaurant entrance, as if calculating whether he could make a run for it. Mr. Daniels didn't give him that chance. Go to the back, the manager ordered one of the staff members. I want that security footage now. The tension in the restaurant thickened. A few customers had completely stopped eating, whispering to one another as they watched the scene unfold. Kyle let out a shaky breath, forcing a weak chuckle. Look, this is ridiculous. It's not like I did anything serious. The guy didn't even eat the food. James's jaw tightened. His patience had limits. He had seen young men like Kyle before, so convinced of their own invincibility, so sure that their actions would never have consequences. He rested his hands on the table, his voice calm but razor sharp. Let me tell you something, son. I've fought in wars. I've lost good men. I've been in places where one wrong move meant the difference between life and death. Kyle shifted uncomfortably, looking anywhere but at James. You think disrespect is harmless? James continued. You think spitting in a man's food is just a joke? Let me tell you what I see when I look at you. I see a boy who never had to fight for anything. A boy who's never been taught what respect really means. Kyle opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Marcus, the staff member sent to retrieve the footage, returned with a laptop. Got it, he said, setting it down on the table. Mr. Daniels pressed play. The screen flickered to life, showing a clear shot of the kitchen. The timestamp matched the moment Kyle had retrieved James's plate. There, for everyone to see, was Kyle leaning slightly over the food. Mr. Daniels' expression darkened. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. Kyle panicked. Wait, that doesn't mean anything. Maybe I was just looking at it. James exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You're not even man enough to admit what you did. Before Kyle could argue further, the restaurant door swung open. Two uniformed police officers stepped inside, scanning the room. They locked eyes with James, and one of them, a tall, broad-shouldered black man, nodded in recognition. James, the officer greeted. You called about a food tampering case? Kyle let out a strangled noise, stepping back. Whoa. Wait a second. You're not actually calling this a crime, right? I mean, come on, it's just food. The officer's expression hardened. You'd be surprised how serious this is. People have been arrested for less. Kyle swallowed hard. He had spent the whole night treating James like he was nothing. Now, for the first time, he realized exactly who he had messed with. Kyle's bravado crumbled as the officers approached him. The smirk he'd worn all night was gone, replaced by a look of pure panic. He glanced around the restaurant, desperate for a way out, but the walls felt like they were closing in. Customers were watching, whispering to each other, and the weight of what he'd done was finally sinking in. Mr. Daniels, the manager, stepped forward, his voice low and stern. Kyle, I don't know what was going through your head, but this behavior is unacceptable. You've disrespected a customer, and now it's clear you've done something that could get this restaurant into serious trouble. Kyle threw up his hands defensively. Come on, Mr. Daniels, it was just a joke. This isn't a joke, James interrupted, his voice sharp. You don't spit in someone's food because you don't like the way they look. You don't treat people like garbage just because you think you can get away with it. One of the officers stepped in, his gaze fixed on Kyle. The fact is, what you did could qualify as a health violation, or worse. And given that there's footage, you should consider yourself lucky that Mr. Carter here isn't pressing criminal charges. Kyle's eyes widened. Wait, charges? Come on, man, it was just... But the officer cut him off. Doesn't matter what you think it was. This is serious. Kyle's shoulders slumped, the reality of the situation finally setting in. He turned to James, the bravado completely gone now. Look, I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean it. I wasn't thinking. James watched him for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. You're right. You weren't thinking, and now you get to live with the consequences. Mr. Daniels stepped forward, his tone final. Kyle, you're fired. Collect your things and get out of my restaurant. Kyle stood there stunned, as if the words hadn't fully registered. But I didn't mean... Now, Mr. Daniels said, cutting him off. Kyle stumbled toward the back of the restaurant, head down, as whispers filled the air. Customers were shaking their heads, and even some of the staff looked relieved to see him go. James let out a slow breath, feeling a sense of justice, but not satisfaction. He hadn't wanted to ruin Kyle's life, but the young man needed to learn that actions have consequences, and that respect is a two-way street. As Kyle disappeared into the back, the officer turned to James. You sure you don't want to press charges? James shook his head. Number, I think he's learned enough for one night. The officer nodded in understanding. Fair enough. Just know that if anything like this happens again, you have every right to take it further. James smiled slightly. Appreciate it, Captain. I hope he takes this lesson to heart. With the situation diffused, James looked around at the staff and customers who had witnessed everything. Tonight wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. He nodded to Mr. Daniels. You've got some good people here. Make sure they know that respect goes both ways. Mr. Daniels met his gaze with a firm nod. You have my word, Mr. Carter. James took one last look around the restaurant before heading toward the door. Tonight, justice had been served, not with anger, but with dignity. As James stepped out into the cool night air, he took a deep breath, letting the tension leave his body. The restaurant door swung shut behind him, but the echoes of the night's events remained. He hadn't planned on making a statement when he walked in for a simple meal, but life had a way of forcing these moments upon him. Inside, the atmosphere of the restaurant had shifted. The waitstaff exchanged uneasy glances, still processing what had just happened. Some customers whispered among themselves, while others simply nodded in quiet approval. And then, the story began to spread. One of the diners, a young woman near the back, had recorded part of the encounter on her phone. She hadn't caught everything, but she had captured the moment when James calmly put Kyle in his place, the look of sheer panic on the young waiter's face, and the way the manager had handled the situation. Within hours, the video was uploaded to social media with the caption, "A black veteran gets disrespected by a racist waiter and handles it like a boss." The video spread like wildfire. Thousands of people commented, outraged at Kyle's behavior, praising James for his composure, and applauding the restaurant's quick response. One comment stood out: "This is why we have to keep holding people accountable. It's not just about one bad waiter, it's about the culture that allows people like him to think they can get away with it." James didn't have social media, but the next morning his phone rang nonstop. Friends, family, and even former military colleagues reached out, telling him that his story was inspiring people across the country. The restaurant, too, felt the impact. Mr. Daniels released a public statement, acknowledging the incident and outlining new training programs for his employees, focusing on bias awareness and customer respect. He assured customers that steps were being taken to prevent anything like this from happening again. But not everyone walked away unscathed. Kyle, now publicly exposed, found himself facing real consequences. The viral nature of the video meant that his name and actions were out in the open. Employers were hesitant to hire someone with such a public display of prejudice attached to their name. 1 week later, James returned to the restaurant, not out of spite, not to gloat, but simply because he still believed in second chances. Isabella, the kind waitress, greeted him with a warm smile. "Mr. Carter, it's good to see you again." "Good to be back," James said, glancing around. The energy in the place felt different, lighter, more aware. As he took his seat, a young man in a server's uniform approached his table, looking nervous. "Sir," the waiter said, voice careful, "I just wanted to say, I saw the video, and I just want you to know, I learned something from it." James nodded, a small, knowing smile.